I'll be in the room.
Yeah, and we're follow-up soon on like the hunger program and all that stuff. I know, but our son was so many great speakers. This is going to not me included.
You're going to have a great time. This is fantastic.
Okay.
Thanks. You take care.
Okay, right here, Miss Miles.
Take a picture. Oh, yeah, with you?
No, it's good.
So you're answering questions, but you're also asking other questions.
Give your
But I like your point.
We don't do this very often, but I think it's one of the moments that I really enjoy and like because I love books and I love reading. And I think we learn a lot through those, and humanity wouldn't be where it is if it wasn't for reading, the accumulation of knowledge, and for the stories that we tell. Now this is a book that I think is really important because the story it tells is how to create action from ideas, and I think that's in the title. Mick Sheldrick is here with us. He's the author of the book, From Ideas to Impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change. And we're happy also that he's joined by a friend and former colleague, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, former Ambassador of Jordan in Washington, also permanent representative of Jordan in the United Nations in New York, and Yasmine Sherif, also friend and former colleague in UNDP, but now the Executive Director of Education, which is still also a UN entity. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Maher Nasser. I'm the Director of the Outreach Division in the UN Department of Global Communication. And the UN Bookshop is part of our operation, as is UN Publications, is part of the Outreach Division. I didn't go into the details of the biographies of the three amazing panelists here, but if you have your phone with you, the QR code on that screen will take you to the Facebook page where their biographies are there. We would spend the whole afternoon if I was going to read their amazing work. So just get that. So you're right, the first successful campaign was related to polio and how you influenced the Australian government to resume funding for polio. What are your thoughts now when one of the rising issues in Gaza, other than the unprecedented and horrific loss of life and destruction, including almost all of the health system infrastructure, the World Health Organization has warned that there's a high risk of spread of polio within Gaza and internationally, as a variant polyvirus type 2 has been detected in several environmental samples. Without an immediate ceasefire and a vast acceleration of humanitarian aid, including the targeted vaccination campaign focused on young children, people will continue to die from preventable, treatable diseases and injuries. What action would you recommend for people concerned about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think as we reflect on polio, I think we should, and there's of course over the last year been many humanitarians who have lost their lives, many staff at the UN, I think a record number, and in the last week, actually while on holiday with family, the head into the mouths of the most remote, marginalized children, whether that's in Gaza, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, or other parts of the world, then how are we going to achieve the SDGs, leave no one behind? Because this is the most basic litmus test. And so with that in mind, the world made great headways, almost bringing polio to the brink of eradication and making it just the second human disease in history to be eradicated, much in large part because, and I think, put your hand up if you're a Rotarian, I think we've got at least 3 in the room, much part because of these guys, but others. And I think one of the ways in which the effort to eradicate polio was successful, in part because Rotarians, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, US Center for Disease Control and Prevention, but was because they were able to make it beyond politics, beyond geopolitics. And one of the most powerful stories
in the history of eradicating polio is this concept of days of tranquility. And it's where literally fighting would be paused, negotiations brokered with the Taliban in order to vaccinate children. And I think right now when you look at whether it's in Gaza, in Afghanistan or Pakistan, which is the two countries where polio has remained endemic, and again, it's no surprise it's where conflict is, that's what we need right now. We need political leadership to broker very similar. If we had days of tranquility then, we can have them now, because there's no reason why polio should be returning, and I think it's the ultimate test of global solidarity.
Thank you. So Zeid and Yasmine, like each of you, maybe some reflections and comments on the book, and Nick's introduction.
No, you're the veteran.
I think just a very nice group of panelists. I think we have a lot in common, and I think a lot of that is coming out in Mick's book. First of all, I was very inspired reading it, and what the world needs now is inspiration. We don't need instructions and divisive language towards one another, but actually inspiration, and to show how it is possible. One thing that struck me when I read your book, because I was here with Maher about 10 years ago launching my own book, and we both had this term of pragmatic idealist. We wrote both, and we didn't know each other by then, now we know each other very well. But you can be an idealist, and the UN is an idealistic organization, and you need ideals, because what would we be without ideals? But you have to be pragmatic in the way you implement them. And that's where I feel that Mick's book, From Ideas to Impact, and the playbook and how to get there, points out the very pragmatic steps that one has to take into consideration in moving forward. And for me personally, when I read it, I think having a visionary mind, with an end goal in mind, you can't just walk rudderless through life. I think the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, and the conventions provide that broader end goals, but within that, you can have many visions, such as a polio campaign to end or have some relative humanity in Gaza for at least those days of polio, but that's not the long-lasting solution, of course.
Over the course of the early part of the summer, my wife and I weren't sure what we were going to be doing in terms of vacation. And Mick was sending me almost an email every few days, and putting my marriage in potential jeopardy. But I realized how persistent he is, and so I'm absolutely delighted to be on this panel. Thank you, Mara, old friend. I'm also happy to be back at the UN bookshop. I mean, for anyone working at the UN, you know that the merch that they sell here is much better than the merch we have in the UN proper. And I used to always, before going on mission, come and get a new hat from the bookshop because they're much better than the ones we have at OHCHR. So the book, I'm taking a little bit of a different approach to this book, and I'm not entirely in agreement with Yasmine. The book is extremely well written. The book is not turgid, which for a UN audience is a balm. It's almost like a tonic. You can read it very quickly. It is filled with interesting anecdotes to support arguments, with references to academia, so it's not just anecdotal. It has, as Maher said, 4 crystal clear examples of the points that Mick is trying to make, and he essentially is trying to answer 4 questions that he poses to himself. So it's an eminently readable, extremely interesting, and I take it as a guide. It's like a manual for how you can think cleverly about mobilizing popular action in support of the right cause and the right vision and the right idea. And that there is a sort of technique to it, there's a cleverness to it. And as Mick said, if you avail yourself of some of the ideas contained in the book, it's immensely helpful. So all of you, please acquire the book and read it. Now, the observation. The book, like any good book, doesn't in the end answer all the questions. What it does, it stimulates the thirst for a second book. I see this as volume 1, and Mick has to start working on volume 2. The reason is this. I slightly disagree with Yasmine in the sense that the cause and the issues that Mick raises are absolutely fundamental. Fundamental in the context of the UN and outside the UN. What Mick hasn't dealt with in the book, and he needs to deal with in the next book, but this is all part of one continuum, is that many of the problems we face are not just the product of circumstance. It is willful policy by individuals. The fossil fuel industry, the top 8 companies are run by individuals. We know their names. We know what their backgrounds are. The people who are undermining very deliberately the international order for profit, we also know who they are. They're not nameless and they're not faceless. We also understand within the member states that states are not monolithic. You have champions within, and I think Mick brings this out in the book, and then people who are going to be weighing against any progress on the very issues that most citizens across the world care about. So it is a game of chess that Mick is inviting us to play, and he's giving us a lesson on the basis of his own experience that can help us. What we haven't progressed to, and this is the next book, is you can develop the basic understanding of how you approach these issues, which he does brilliantly, I think, and Global Citizen is just fantastic at it. But then you have to tailor it to each specific circumstance. And the issues are not simple, and they require very careful working through. So my appeal would be, first of all, you have to read the book. It's an excellent, excellent book, and all credit to you, Mick. And the next appeal is to urge him to now write the second one about how we deal with the very people who actually create the agony and the pain. Yeah? And I'm not sure, in one part of your book, you were saying that we should talk to everyone. That you mentioned David Beasley, a colleague who used to run WFP. I'm not sure. There were certain limits beyond which I would never have been comfortable going. I was prepared to talk to many, but there are certain limits beyond which I'm not prepared to talk. And I think, so I would, there are variations on that. But above all is that the book makes you think. And I think it's the greatest tribute that can be paid to any author, that he's providing us with amazing pearls of wisdom, but he's also making us think and thirst for more. So well done.
I think, Maha, just to quickly respond to that, and I like the point.
There's a lack of commitment
on delivery on the Paris Agreement, on the SDGs, where we are 17%. That's good.
And I think your book gives them a tool kit of how to go about influencing policy. I think young people need to get back in the game of getting involved, vote when you can, where you can. I think this year we had 60% of the world's population went for elections. I think this is something that we have to realize. We wouldn't have been able to deal with major challenges without policy changes at the top. So in the book you talk about the visionary entrepreneur and then the importance of storytelling. And in the prelogue you start, this is a serious book, but it starts with a quote from Gandalf the Wizard from J.J.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. So stories, and I think we as a Department of Global Communications, we think that stories are the way we need to communicate with the world, not just young people. People will forget the numbers, they will forget the facts, but they will not forget the story on how it made them feel. So maybe you can talk a bit more, and you've already given a few stories, but the importance of centrality of storytelling in transforming from ideas to impact.
So that is your audience, and I fully agree with Zeid, and I'm a human rights lawyer myself, and you perform a High Commission for Human Rights. There are some you simply cannot talk to. The only time you talk with them is in the courthouse, you know, the tribunal, and we cannot compromise on that. Never compromise on the rule of law, and that applies to international law. But I think your target group is for the people who still have, as I said, sanity, maybe needs imagination, they need the spark. And I think through your book, because you are so good at backing up everything you say with concrete examples, not just your own, going back in history, giving examples that are real, showing what it looks like. So I think it has to do with the audience, and I would assume that all of you and all your friends and the majority in your surroundings are people who still think and breathe like most of us in humanity, wanting to do good, and who have clarity of mind and openness of heart. And this is the book that concretizes all of this, definitely. And this is probably the only time I've read a book like that. I think it's an amazing book. Thank you.
But what we actually see as remarkably is somehow people's identity as global citizens, majorities of people around the world, still cling on to that. It's not 90%, it's not 70%, it's not even 60%, but it is the majority. Poll after poll show that. And people still have this faith in each other and the power of collective action. They don't necessarily see the payoffs, and that's where there's a huge window of opportunity. And where the power of storytelling comes in is we know that the research all shows that in an age of lack of trust, people don't trust the institutions around them, but they still do listen to their friends and family. And sharing stories of success, stories of impact with our friends and family is one of the best ways to instill a bias to action in others and overcome the sense that there's nothing we can do. And one of the studies I recently read by Locality showed, in terms of where we need to focus the power of storytelling, you know, as part of this age of despair, all age groups below the age of 55 are saying, you know, we're going to be worse off, this isn't going to get better. And in particular, what we're seeing is a gender gap, because young women, right, they're not all, and you can't generalize, but the studies actually show that young women between the ages of 18 and 32 gravitate and say, okay, there's a problem, they gravitate towards collaboration. Cooperation is the answer. Young men gravitate towards individualism. Time. She was due to be born on October 30th, and so I said, okay, that's the deadline. Finished the manuscript on October 9th, and then we were planning, okay, we go and watch a Broadway show. This is our last time together before our baby arrives. And I got a phone call from my mom in Australia. She works in aged care, and she said, there's a guy who just came in, and he asked for you, and he remembered you. And I said, who's this guy coming into an aged care home on the other side of the world? And she goes, do you remember this gentleman called Len? And I had this image of this older gentleman, 2 walking sticks. 20 years ago, finished high school, I would walk down to the park at the end of the street, and there was always this older guy, 2 walking sticks, and he had this dog, Tramp, because it looked like the dog from Lady and the Tramp, wiry grey hair. And I was like, yeah, but how old is he? And my mum said he's 105, and he remembers you, and he's just been checked in, and he wants to speak to you. And so we ended up FaceTiming with Len. Len was born in 1917. He got married in 1939. This was in the UK. Shortly after that, when war erupted in Europe, he got sent to France.
About your views on the young. So I've seen a rather remarkable transition since I started this 5 years ago. And it really is that more and more, particularly Gen Z, see it less than a climate challenge and more the chance to build a clean economy. And I think they actually find the climate piece almost offensive because they think it's kind of politicized what they see as an extraordinary economic opportunity. And in a way, they align more with Tom Steyer than Greta Thunberg. So I'm kind of curious what you guys think about that.
And speak up and speak your mind and adopt your own opinions. which are leaning more towards human rights, justice, equity. We see it in Global Citizen, that every summer I see them in Central Park, and we engage a lot with education and way in Global Citizen, the way that they have captured that wave of the Gen Z generation. And I see from my own children, I see from all the young, I think it's a new generation that is not only positively and creatively speaking up and looking at issues without feeling, I would say, inhibited. You have to follow authority, you have to do what authority says.
Thank you to Yasmine, who's been promoting the book inside and outside UCW. So my question is, how does your book tackle the concept of power? And how do policy entrepreneurs and change makers handle the power play and politics and international development? And in addition to that, I have a sub-question. How different is the toolkit for those who are less resourced, less powerful, less privileged? Is their toolkit for pursuing change different from those who are well off? And this is it. And again, thank you for the inspiration, Ming.
It's an immensely difficult question to answer because you need an immense amount of knowledge and a precise knowledge to know how to move a particular system. But you can compensate with complete courage, moral clarity, right, which is absolutely required. And here at the UN, something we're not good at is moral consistency. To be consistent. The hardest work, and this is something that actually Mick touches on in the book, that you do is often in your neighborhood, in your family, in your community. Prejudice, chauvinism, the scramble for economic power, the scramble for commercial power. It's a rather primitive way of thinking. It sort of speaks to our reptilian nature more than anything else. And then fear stokes reactions to it. And so you have to overcome it. E.O. Wilson at Harvard pointed out that there are only 3 species on this planet that will sacrifice for the good of the whole species. Ants, bees, and human beings. That we would give up that first instinct of self-preservation to sacrifice for everyone else is an amazing thing that people will do. And so if you don't have the command of knowledge, you can surely show courage and understand what consistency is and what clarity is. And so you remind me very much, I was in a small community in Sri Lanka when I was High Commissioner, and the very same question was raised to me. They said to me, High Commissioner, we're a small community, we're a Tamil community here, we have no power, we have no this, we have no cars, we have no money. And I said, yes, but you have good ideas, you have shown courage, all you need is a way of disseminating the idea, and you're already in a position of leadership, whether you know it or not. So, but the idea is really couched in precision. Much of the upheavals we see in the world can be traced to individuals doing things which they ought not to have done. Right? I mean, you can go back and say populism in Europe after the Second World War. How did it begin? Well, clearly there you had the National Fronts in France and the UK, 1968, 1972. You had on the other end of the ideological spectrum, you had the communists in Italy, the Radical Party, and so forth. But then it all began really in Carinthia in 1986 with Georg Haider in Austria, and then Berlusconi came after him and opened the door wide. So their names, they're people we know, they shouldn't be hiding, or at least let's say their ideological descendants shouldn't be hiding. And quite frankly, and this is why I think the UN always can do more, is that, and here perhaps, if there's one appeal in terms of the book, I was always uncomfortable with the idea of shaming by virtue of highlighting something. Because it almost implies that the other side doesn't feel any shame for its own actions. Right? So the shaming shouldn't come from the highlighting. the shaming should come from the people who deny their own people access to proper health care because the climatic conditions are changing, access to a normal way of a livelihood because sea level rise is occurring. And it's that sort of thing that where the shame should be positioned. But courage can mean a lot. I mean, look, you just have to sit in the UN in any meeting. When I was PR for almost 18 years. There's not much confrontation that takes place outside of the Security Council, right? And if it is, it's on little things, some words here or there and so forth. But a sort of intellectual honesty about the state of the world and where it needs to go, sometimes it's missing. And it's always refreshing. I mean, we used to have ambassadors in the past who were just so outrageous and they were fun to listen to, but they weren't cowed into silence because of the atmospherics of the UN. And I think a little bit that's gone missing, and that's what we need to bring back.
I think just on the second question, building on the point around intellectual honesty, I think those of us that work in advocacy and in the non-profit world have to really grapple with two truths as I see it. The first is that often advocacy, you're paid by your funders, right? And funders incentivize often.
And we have seen examples just from the UK from earlier this month when a lie led to incitement against Muslims first and then asylum seekers, refugees and migrants. So let's put that aside. How can people who want to move from ideas to impact better leverage that ability to spread the right information and to stop the disinformation?
I mean, I think,
Very brief.
yeah, very briefly, but I've thought about this quite a bit in general, and I love the word reptiles. I feel when I grew up, you didn't lie. This is just an ethic that you're taught at home. You don't lie. Lying is very bad. You're taught a value system. And having a broad perspective of all world relations and respecting everyone and all cultures, that is the kind of home I came from. And I realized that the world we have today, you don't need to be sophisticated, intellectually honest, compassionate, and empathetic in order to be powerful. That you can be just as a reptile. As long as you have the money, you run and you run the show. I think it starts with the parents, it starts with education, and I come from education, cannot wait, leaving that fun. What are we putting into the heads and the hearts and the souls of our young generation during the most formative years? Because when they grow up, they might be the next commander of a mass slaughter, or they might be the next Gandhi or Nelson Mandela. And you as a parent make that determination. And in the meantime, we who were brought up with those values and made those values that live by, we must not be silenced. We must not. We do have a freedom of expression. And human rights is something we always have to protect, even, and that's where courage comes in. That's what moral courage comes in, is to protect our moral clarity and act accordingly. And I think your book is helping us a long way on that. Thank you, Mick.
So just final two thoughts. I mean, when listening to Mick talk about Global Citizen, we've just finished 2.5 weeks or 3 weeks of the Olympic Games. And all of us remember certain things from the Games. But I don't think anyone watching Mongo Duplantis do the final jump, the pole vault, was screaming for him to succeed because he was a Swedish-American citizen. We were screaming to see him succeed because no human had ever scaled that height. And everyone in the stadium, including the competitors, were urging him to succeed. I mean, so this issue of whether he was Swedish or American, it was sort of secondary. It was the same with the amazing story of the Pakistani javelin thrower, who was best friends with the Indian javelin thrower who got the silver. And from Pakistan, the village had all sort of we were all behind him, and we all were cheering a human being who was throwing a javelin further than anyone had thrown it in the Olympic Games. And isn't that just so beautiful? It just goes back to the point about tribalism. I think in terms of humanity, I really subscribe to the thinking of Amin Maalouf and Amartya Sen in terms of identity. And that surely must be the only way we can ever succeed. That you can be proud of who you are in terms of your nationality, your religion, your ethnicity, your lineage, your genealogy, all of that. But your individual, you as an individual have so many points of reference that determine who you are. Your interests, how you associate yourself politically. And if we keep it all in balance, we have a sane humanity. If I put too much attachment to one of the issues, that only religion is important to me, only my nationality, only my ethnicity, and if you're not part of it, then you're on the other side, that's where we become primitive, and we remain primitive. So I think they offer us a guide out.
And often I'm in all interest in hearing Zeid speak. Shortly after, October 7th and the conflict in Gaza and the atrocities we're seeing probably on our screen, I remember watching an interview with you where you spoke about the tribalism of pain. And I think that tribalism of pain, and building off what you were just saying there, in the book I talk about this concept of the purity test, where people often feel like they're forced to take sides, and if they take a side or they take a position, often the biggest fear is from their own side, that they might be casted out or outed as a traitor or for acts of betrayal. And yet, all of the advocates I spoke to, whether it was the Minister of Administration, Prime Minister Motley, yourself and others, spoke about the fact that, okay, you may not speak to everyone, but you recognize that in creating change, you have to speak to certain people outside your own tribe. And one thing I learned, and I will say, over the last couple of months, often speaking in defense of the UN, I've received often hate mail and messages and things, particularly for Dr. Tedros' quote on here, who I think is an incredible humanitarian and have much support for him. And I've been defending the UN because I see it. I see people writing letters also about institutions of international collaboration, threatening members of those institutions if they come out and say one thing. And yet the thing I've realized is no amount of argument, often when I get into with people of certain persuasion, is going to change their mind. And it reminds me of something I understood early as an advocate when I would knock on politicians' doors in Australia, try and find people of the other side, find that member of parliament and be like, I've got one of them and I'm not going to let them go even if they're looking for security to throw us out of the building. And it was someone said to me, who said, Michael, understand that it's not about winning arguments. Because when you focus on winning arguments, you're focused on how you are feeling leaving that conversation. Did I score a point? Did I win that debate? It's about how you leave people feeling. And it's about feeling, and I think that's really our work, and when it comes to narrative building, storytelling, and that's the big challenge ahead of us.
In the back, Mick will stay here to sign copies for you. And I also would like to reiterate maybe Zeid's challenge for you, Mick. Version 2.
It was funny, I got told when they gave it to me and they said Audible, I was expecting to be able to do it myself, and they said, oh, you're not big enough yet, and they got another Australian living in New York to record it instead. So it comes down to how successful book one is. But yes, I'll definitely do that. And maybe I'll take you up to properly interview this time and put your stories on record. But yes, that would be great.
Well, thank you all. Thank you everyone for being with us.